April 12, 1945. The thunder of conflict across Europe had subsided, leaving behind a weary hush. In the southern reaches of Germany, April's sun struggled to pierce the lingering haze of war-torn towns. Fields that once flourished in verdant hues were now scarred by the crisscrossing gouges of tank treads and the desolate emptiness of frozen artillery impacts. The world held its breath as the war entered its final, convulsive moments. Columns of American soldiers from the 7th Army pushed onward, passing the shattered remnants of Nuremberg, their engines purring with a fatigued rhythm. They had borne witness to unspeakable atrocities, burning convoys, emaciated civilians, and soldiers still clinging to a vanquished cause. Yet nothing could have prepared them for what lay ahead. On the fringes of a humble Bavarian hamlet named Schwag, a schoolhouse stood in a state of semi-collapse. Wisps of smoke curled from its roof, and the nearby church bell had surrendered to the heat, melting into a shapeless mass of bronze. A detachment of American infantry advanced with caution, their rifles at the ready, their boots crunching on a mixture of shattered glass and pulverized chalk. They anticipated an ambush, perhaps a last-ditch stand by fanatical youths. Instead, they were met with the unmistakable sound of infants crying. Not the sharp cries of the injured, but the thin, desperate wails of the very young. Within the schoolhouse, the makeshift infirmary was constructed from the remains of broken desks and tattered sheets, resembling tattered flags of surrender. Amidst the debris, the mingled scents of disinfectant and burnt plaster, a dozen young women clad in stained nurses' uniforms moved with an almost spectral grace. Their Red Cross insignia, once vibrant, had faded to a pale pink, bearing the marks of blood and rain. One among them, barely 20 years of age, her fair hair darkened with soot, gently cradled an infant nearby. Another painstakingly heated water in a dented enamel bowl. They froze as the soldiers entered, their rifles, helmets, and the unfamiliar faces of men whose language had always signified menace, filling the room. For a prolonged moment, an unbroken silence reigned. Then, the squad leader, a man named Corporal David Miller, who had been a farmer in Illinois before the war, was the first to lower his weapon. "It's all right," he said softly. Though his words were unintelligible to them, his tone conveyed a sense of peace. One of the nurses cautiously stepped forward, her frame trembling. She gestured towards the crying infant in her arms and then to an empty bottle beside her, speaking rapidly in German. Miller turned to his medic. "She says there's no milk," the medic translated, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "None for 2 days." Outside, the rumble of trucks heading to the next village echoed the urgency of their orders. Clear, advance, secure. But Miller remained. He surveyed the scene. A chalkboard adorned with arithmetic problems, now blackened by smoke. A child's shoe peeking from beneath the rubble. And a pervasive atmosphere of deprivation. The nurses themselves were gaunt, their eyes hollow, their fear not of death, but of these imposing figures. For years, they had been conditioned to believe Americans were monsters, yet here stood these monsters, rendered immobile by the faint cries of infants too weak to sob audibly. A baby's cough, a fragile, rattling sound, silenced the room. Miller exhaled deeply. "Get the jeep," he commanded quietly, "and bring whatever field rations we have left." Within minutes, the Americans returned, their contribution consisting of a few cans of condensed milk, a mess kit, and matches. It was meager, but it was something. The women watched intently as the soldiers awkwardly heated the milk, stirring it with the handle of a bayonet. One of the nurses, after a moment's hesitation, stepped forward and accepted the tin. She signaled for them to cease, indicating she would handle the task. The soldiers retreated, observing as she carefully poured the warmed milk into a cracked glass bottle, tested its temperature on her wrist, and then offered it to the smallest infant. The baby latched on, and a quiet settled over the room. A palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere, a silence imbued not with apprehension, but with awe. Miller ran a hand over the back of his neck. "They aren't soldiers," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. The medic nodded in agreement. "No, just people trying to keep other people alive." For the nurses, the Americans presented a perplexing paradox. They arrived armed, imposing, and foreign, yet their expressions softened at the sound of distressed infants. When an interpreter finally arrived from headquarters, communication, though rudimentary, became possible. The Americans inquired about their identities and their circumstances. The nurses explained that their hospital in Nuremberg had been devastated by bombing. They had fled with the infants, seeking refuge in the countryside. Some of the babies were German, others were refugees from the Eastern Territories, all of them abandoned when their mothers succumbed to death or starvation during their journey. They had subsisted on rainwater and mashed potatoes, but their provisions were now exhausted. As twilight descended, the Americans illuminated the scene with lanterns and brought blankets from their vehicles. The barn adjacent to the schoolhouse was cleared of its straw, transforming into a makeshift sanctuary. The women were informed they could rest there for the night. One nurse, her name barely audible, Anneliese, offered her gratitude in broken English, her voice cracking with emotion. "For the children," she whispered. Miller found himself at a loss for words, offering only a nod. He thought of his own daughter back home, a 4-year-old with curls mirroring the child Anneliese held. He hadn't seen her since 1943. Gazing at the baby in Anneliese's arms, he felt an overwhelming distance from the concept of victory. By the time the moon ascended, the barn was aglow with a gentle light. Inside, soldiers sat alongside the nurses, passing around bottles and cups, meticulously measuring portions with the precision of seasoned artillerymen. Someone softly hummed an old American lullaby, and one of the women joined in, her voice a near inaudible whisper, as if she had forgotten the act of singing. Outside, the distant echoes of gunfire reverberated like the fading peals of thunder. The front lines were shifting northward, towards the Danube, leaving behind pockets of surrender and disbelief. Yet, within the confines of that barn, a different kind of battle was drawing to a close, the one between the abstract notion of an enemy and the tangible reality of a fellow human being. Later, when the soldiers recounted their discovery, a lieutenant questioned Miller about the delay in their advance. Miller simply replied, "We found something that needed guarding." The lieutenant's brow furrowed. A German hospital? Miller turned his gaze back towards the barn, where faint cries mingled with hushed voices. "No," he stated quietly. "Life." The war would continue for a few more weeks. Town after town would fall, Hitler would perish, the Reich would crumble. But on that night in Schwag, beneath a canopy of starlight filtering through a fractured roof, a small contingent of soldiers and nurses shared a fleeting ceasefire of the soul. As dawn broke, a delicate frost adorned the fields. Smoke ascended from the barn's chimney. Someone had kindled a small fire to warm the milk. The soldiers made preparations to move on. The nurses stood by, clutching their meager blankets, uncertain whether they would be left behind or taken prisoner. The interpreter offered assurances that the Americans would return after securing the adjacent town. They nodded, though their eyes betrayed their lingering doubt. As the convoy began to pull away, one of the infants resumed its crying. Miller looked back through the swirling dust and exhaust fumes, observing Anneliese lift the child. Cradling it close, her face turned towards the rising sun. For a fleeting instant, he envisioned her as any mother, in any country, in the aftermath of any conflict. The jeep lurched forward. The barn dwindled behind them, gradually swallowed by the mist. The war had not yet concluded, but a profound shift had occurred within him. And though he was unaware of it at the time, this was not the last he would see of those nurses. By the second morning, the barn carried the distinct aroma of smoke, milk, and damp straw. Sunlight seeped through the wooden planks, casting stripes across the faces of the German nurses as they attended to their duties. Outside, the steady hum of a truck engine, like a quiet heartbeat, vibrated somewhere beyond the frost. Inside, life clung to the air, fragile, precarious, yet undeniably present. The Americans had returned as promised, bearing additional cans of milk, soap, and a few ration tins. They handled their equipment with an almost apologetic awkwardness, as if embarrassed by the gentleness of their task. None of them had ever envisioned a conflict culminating in the feeding of infants. The barn, once a dwelling for livestock, now sheltered 23 infants swaddled in blankets salvaged from army tents. Some were orphans of aerial bombardments, others born to mothers who had perished on the arduous journey. The nurses knew each child intimately, every soft whimper, every shallow breath. They moved with quiet deliberation between the cots, their sleeves rolled to the elbows, their hair secured with makeshift gauze ties. Their hands were raw and red from the ceaseless scrubbing of bottles in frigid water, yet their movements possessed a rhythm, a quiet discipline born of a refusal to succumb to chaos. Corporal David Miller entered, accompanied by the medic and the interpreter, stamping the snow from his boots. "Morning," he offered, though it sounded more like a tentative question. The interpreter relayed the greeting in German. Anneliese, one of the nurses, nodded, her gaze barely lifting as she fed a child no larger than a loaf of bread. The infant's eyes fluttered open, a soft, uncertain blue. Miller paused, then placed a box of supplies near her feet. "More milk," he stated. "From Nuremberg base." The interpreter conveyed his words, and Anneliese murmured a simple danke. He found it striking how naturally that word resonated in this place, so removed from the world that had instilled in them a profound animosity towards one another. He watched as she tilted the bottle, her movements precise to avoid spilling a single drop. Around her, the other nurses whispered in low tones, a blend of German and lullabies. The air within the barn felt warmer now. The Americans had repaired the stove, ingeniously adapting spare parts from a Jeep engine. The soldiers had even procured tin cups and established a system of shared responsibilities. The nurses attended to the infants, while the soldiers fetched water and maintained the fire. The inherent absurdity of the situation was not lost on anyone. "Guess this is one way to win hearts and minds," one private quipped, earning a sharp glare from the medic. The interpreter, a young man from New York with a hesitant command of German, attempted to bridge the silence. He inquired about the nurses' work, their homes, and their training. Most demurred, uncertain of the purpose behind his questions. Finally, Anneliese responded softly, "We are Red Cross. No politics, only blood and crying." Miller understood her sentiment, even without translation. He studied her face not out of attraction, but from a sense of recognition. She bore a striking resemblance to how his wife might have looked had the war allowed her adequate rest. Hours slipped by in a peculiar stillness. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery echoed like an approaching storm. Inside, time seemed to stretch and thin. The babies slept soundly. The nurses murmured quiet prayers over them. Occasionally, a soldier would offer an awkward smile, unsure of how to occupy his hands. These were men trained for destruction, now tasked with safeguarding the most vulnerable beings on Earth. The irony of it permeated every gesture. In a corner, one of the younger nurses, Greta, inadvertently spilled a pot of milk. It hissed as it struck the hot stove. She gasped, her eyes welling with tears, overwhelmed by sheer exhaustion. Without a second thought, Miller knelt beside her, offering a clumsy pat on her shoulder. "It's okay," he reassured her. Though she didn't comprehend the words, she understood the gentle intent. She covered her face, whispering in German, "Es ist alles verloren." The interpreter softly translated. She says, "Everything is lost." Miller surveyed the scene. The makeshift infirmary, the shivering infants, the women who refused to cease their work, and shook his head. "Not everything," he said quietly. By evening, snow began to fall once more. The barn glowed from within, lanterns casting a flickering light over tired faces. The nurses had begun to tentatively trust the soldiers, allowing them to hold the babies. Laughter, though small and hesitant, began to punctuate the air. One medic, O'Hara from Boston, struggled to cradle a child in his massive arms. The baby wailed, prompting a burst of laughter from the nurses, the first they had shared since the war's commencement. He grinned sheepishly. "Guess I'm better at fixing men than feeding them," he admitted. Annalise reached over and adjusted his grip, demonstrating how to properly support the infant's neck. When the baby finally quieted, she spoke a phrase in German that required no translation. "Gentle." Later, as they shared tins of stew, conversation began to bloom like a hesitant spring. The interpreter relayed jokes, often imperfectly understood, yet sufficient to elicit smiles. The nurses learned the Americans' names: Miller, O'Hara, Jameson, Reed. In turn, the soldiers learned theirs. For a few precious hours, the distinctions of sides, flags, and orders vanished, replaced by a shared exhaustion and the comforting warmth of companionship. Yet, beyond this circle of light, the world continued to burn. A passing patrol brought disquieting news, rumors of surrender, reports of refugees, stray gunfire on the roads. The lieutenant who visited surveyed the scene with a frown. "We can't stay here," he informed Miller. "Headquarters requires all civilians to be moved by dawn." Miller protested. "They're nurses, sir, and the babies." But the officer cut him short. "Orders. We move them to the main camp tomorrow. Don't get attached." That night, Miller found sleep elusive. The barn creaked in the wind. He sat near the door, his rifle resting across his knees, listening to the quiet breaths emanating from within. The babies made small sounds, snuffles, sighs, hiccups, each one feeling heavier than the silence that punctuated the gunshots. He thought again of his daughter, her photograph tucked within his jacket pocket, its edges worn smooth. The war had stripped him of nearly everything: friends, sleep, the very notion of peace. Yet here, among people he had been taught to despise, he had discovered something startlingly close to it. Annalise stirred and approached quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She gestured towards the fire, then at him. "You cold?" she asked, her accent thick but earnest. He offered a faint smile. "A little?" She hesitated, then added, "Tomorrow we go." He nodded. "Orders." Her expression remained unchanged, but her shoulders seemed to draw inward. "Baby's safe?" she inquired. He gazed into the fire for a long moment before responding. "I'll make sure of it." She nodded once and returned to her cot. As she lay down, she began to hum a lullaby so soft it was barely audible. The words were foreign, but the melody carried a poignant resemblance to melodies from home. Before dawn, snow once again blanketed the landscape. The lieutenant's trucks arrived, their headlights piercing the dense fog. The nurses gathered their few possessions: bundles of cloth, makeshift bottles, scraps of food. The babies were carefully loaded into crates lined with straw. The soldiers worked with a somber efficiency, their faces impassive. It was meant to be a routine operation, yet it felt like an ending. As the engines sputtered to life, Miller cast one final glance back at the barn. The stove was dying out. The milk cans were neatly stacked by the door. On the wall, a child's drawing remained: a son, a house, and a family holding hands. It trembled in the draught, appearing almost alive. He climbed into the jeep. The convoy lurched forward, tires crunching over the frozen mud. The barn receded into the gray distance, eventually becoming just another indistinct shape in a landscape of ruins. He did not yet know it, but within days, that barn would transform into something entirely different. Part sanctuary, part scandal, and part secret. A place where mercy had dared to exist, and where mercy, as it often does, would be profoundly misunderstood. The convoy reached the outskirts of Ansbach by noon, traversing a world that appeared half deceased, half poised for rebirth. The fields were pocked with shell craters, the trees stripped bare. Smoke curled from the chimneys of houses that no longer possessed walls. The war was drawing to a close, but no one could yet articulate what would emerge in its place. Inside the trucks, the German nurses sat in silent contemplation, each clutching an infant, their faces a mixture of apprehension and disbelief. The American soldiers escorting them spoke little. They were combatants, not caregivers, and this peculiar assignment, protecting their former adversaries, felt like venturing beyond the established parameters of warfare. They arrived at a requisitioned monastery situated on a hill overlooking the town. Its courtyard was a muddy expanse from the melted snow, and a white flag hung limply from a window. Within, American medics had established makeshift infirmaries and tables. The air was thick with the scent of iodine, hay, and diesel. The women were ushered into one wing, the soldiers occupying the other. An uneasy quiet settled over the compound. No one was entirely certain who was the prisoner and who was the guest. Corporal Miller toiled alongside the medics throughout the afternoon, setting up sanitation stations and unloading supplies. Periodically, he would steal glances towards the doorway, where the nurses, clad in their subdued uniforms, awaited direction. The interpreter struggled to convey the newly issued directives. They were to remain under protective custody until the front lines stabilized. Annalise listened attentively, her gaze steady. She inquired if they would be permitted to continue their care for the babies. When the interpreter nodded, she seemed to exhale for the first time in hours. "Then we stay," she stated quietly. News of their presence spread with remarkable speed through the nearby villages. Locals converged at the gates, some imploring for food, others demanding an explanation for the Americans' protection of German women. An elderly man vociferously declared that traitors ought to be punished, not sheltered. A young girl hurled a stone that clattered harmlessly against the gatepost. Fear had distorted everything. Even compassion had become a source of suspicion. Within the monastery walls, a simmering distrust also pervaded among the soldiers. A few grumbled that their duty was not to act as nurses. "Next thing you know," one remarked, "we'll be knitting socks for the SS." Miller disregarded the comment, but the underlying tension was palpable. A quiet, corrosive undercurrent. That evening, during their rations, O'Hara muttered, "Feels wrong, doesn't it? Feeding the same folks who cheered while we bled in the Ardennes." Miller did not look up. "Yeah," he conceded. "Feels right too." The following morning, the babies began to fall ill. Diarrhea, fever, persistent coughing, the symptoms were alarming. The medics descended into a state of panic. They possessed antibiotics, but lacked any knowledge of appropriate pediatric dosages. The German nurses, drawing upon their experience, took charge. They meticulously boiled water, sterilized bottles, and soothed the children throughout the night. Miller observed their tireless efforts, witnessing how exhaustion and instinct coalesced into an act of profound grace. As dawn broke, the fevers had subsided. "They saved them," he remarked quietly to the lieutenant. The officer offered a shrug, unwilling to acknowledge what both men implicitly understood. Without the nurse's intervention, half the infants would likely have perished. Later that day, an army photographer arrived to document the civilian relief efforts. He captured images of nurses in uniforms far too thin for the spring chill, of soldiers cradling infants, and of milk bottles arranged like ammunition. He attempted to orchestrate the scenes, urging, "Smile, sweetheart." But the women remained unsmiling, their eyes burdened with an immeasurable weight. The flashbulb ignited, and for a fleeting moment the room blazed with an unreal brilliance. Enemies captured in the same frame, neither victorious nor defeated, simply human. That photograph, though its significance went unrecognized at the time, would later serve as evidence in a contentious debate about the nature of mercy in the immediate aftermath of surrender. As the days progressed, a distinct rhythm began to emerge within the monastery. The nurses and soldiers started to share tasks, meals, and even laughter. The interpreter imparted English words to the women: blanket, baby, friend, in exchange for the lullabies they taught him. However, the fragile calm outside the monastery's walls grew increasingly agitated. German civilians, some starving, others still harboring loyalty to a defunct regime, observed from beyond the gates. Rumors circulated. The Americans were fraternizing with enemy consorts, rewarding those who had supported their adversaries. Some even alleged that the soldiers were fathering the very children they protected. One afternoon, as Miller was transporting supplies from a truck, he discovered crude graffiti scrawled across the monastery wall: "Feeding the enemy." The letters, etched in charcoal, were rough and defiant. He stared at them for a long time before scrubbing them away with his sleeve. That night, however, sleep eluded him. The implication of the graffiti gnawed at him. He had come to this place to combat tyranny, to alleviate suffering, yet here he was, accused of treason for extending compassion. That same night, an American major from headquarters arrived unannounced. His uniform was immaculate, his boots polished to a gleam. He demanded an inspection of the civilian quarters. The nurses stood at attention, visibly apprehensive. The major moved through the rows of cots, a clipboard in hand, meticulously noting every perceived irregularity. He stopped abruptly when he reached Annalise, who was cradling a child. "Who authorized this?" he demanded curtly. Miller stepped forward. "I did, sir. They're feeding the orphans." The major's eyes narrowed. "Your orders were to transport civilians, not to operate a nursery." Miller's voice remained calm, yet firm. "Sir, with utmost regard, we could not permit them to perish from hunger." The commanding officer observed him for a spell. "Kindness, Corporal, does not prevail in conflict," he stated with frigidity. Miller met his intense regard. "Perhaps it brings them to an end." The ensuing quiet was as piercing as a firearms report. The officer departed without utterance. The subsequent morning, an official decree arrived. All German civilians, including the medical staff, were to be relocated to a more substantial containment facility near Bamberg. Miller perused the document a second time, his jaw clenching. He instructed the translator to convey the message to the women. Upon hearing the news, Annalise did not weep. She simply stated, "We depart once more." Her composure unsettled him more profoundly than any tears could have. That evening, as preparations for their departure commenced, the local populace congregated beyond the barrier. Some hurled insults, while others merely offered vacant stares. A young lad discharged spittle towards the passing transport. The sentries paid it no heed, yet one of the attending nurses murmured a plea under her breath. Her supplication was not for personal safety. She prayed for absolution. As the procession advanced, snow began to descend anew. Delicate, wafting flakes that rendered the devastated terrain spectral. The roadway meandered between scorched arboreal sentinels. In the rear of the vehicle, Annalise cradled one of the ailing infants to her bosom, emitting a soft croon. The infant's respiration stabilized, then quieted. Miller cast a backward glance from the driver's seat, catching her likeness in the reflective surface. A subtle smile, a minor triumph. He refocused his attention on the path ahead. The hostilities would conclude imminently, so it was said. The Führer was cornered within his subterranean refuge. Berlin was nearly encircled. Yet an instinct told him that the most arduous phase was not the cessation of hostilities. It was determining the character of individuals who would endure once it had concluded. As twilight descended, the convoy reached a junction. To the left lay Bamberg and its administrative apparatus. To the right, a less traveled track veered towards the woodlands where the map indicated nothing whatsoever. The junior officer directed them to the left. Miller wavered for a mere instant before complying. The steering wheel felt slick beneath his grasp. Behind them, the infant stirred. The nurses whispered. The snow intensified. From a distant locale, the din of ordnance resounded one final time. Then, a profound, untainted, uncertain silence. And though no one voiced it, every soul within that convoy comprehended it. They were no longer adversaries in transit together. They were witnesses to compassion, and compassion in warfare was its own form of defiance. Decades elapsed before any mention was made of the barn, or the monastic sanctuary, or the convoy that had once traversed a failing Germany carrying infants rather than armaments. The world was occupied with its own reconstruction, forging history through concrete and treaties, selectively choosing which chronicles to preserve and which to enter beneath a shroud of silence. The photographic prints slumbered as well, sequestered within an army repository, their designations faded, their subjects unidentified. It was not until the vernal period of 1971 that the receptacle was opened. The chronicler was a man of quiet disposition named Peter Landrum, an academic researcher meticulously organizing antiquated United States Signal Corps film spools for a veteran initiative. He was in pursuit of battlefield records, cartographic representations, aerial bombardments, and unit rosters when he discovered a diminutive, unmarked envelope lodged between folders designated Nuremberg Cleanup and Civilian Operations Bavaria. Within resided 23 monochrome prints, their edges curling. At a superficial examination, they appeared commonplace. Soldiers, females, youngsters, yet something about them arrested his attention. In one depiction, a nurse attired in a ragged uniform held an infant against her person, her expression weary yet resolute. Behind her, a soldier from the United States leaned over a hearth, warming milk in a metal receptacle. The inscription on the verso read, "Only Schwig, April 45." Landrum scrutinized it further. The soldier's visage, half obscured by shadow, half illuminated by the fire's glow, conveyed a tenderness utterly incongruous with the theater of war. He turned the subsequent photograph. A series of infant cots, newborns swaddled in improvised coverings, nurses bent like celestial beings over their charges. A subtle American ensign was discernible behind them, affixed to a fractured timber. A tremor coursed through him. This was not the sort of imagery that historical narratives typically retained. There was no exultation here. No capitulation, no raising of a banner, merely benevolence. And benevolence, he mused, was the sole element for which conflict possessed no lexicon. Landrum traced the photograph's designation to an army inventory, and subsequently to a veteran's appellation, Corporal David Miller, 7th United States Army Medical Corps. The records indicated his honorable separation in 1946, his repatriation to Illinois, and his demise in 1959 from cardiac arrest. No allusion to the photographs, no commendation, merely a file concluding in silence. But within that silence, something lay in wait. Months thereafter, Landrum located a surviving German nurse enumerated in post-war Red Cross correspondences. Her name was Annelie Schreiber, aged 83, residing in Munich. Upon his arrival, she greeted him at her threshold, diminutive and bright-eyed, her hands exhibiting a slight tremor indicative of age, not apprehension. On her mantelpiece stood framed portraits of grandchildren and a faded Crimson Cross emblem. He apprised her of his discovery. For an extended interval, she offered no reply. Then, she offered a gentle smile, akin to one recalling sunlight piercing through a snowfall. "They requested us to sustain them," she articulated. Her English, though deliberate, was distinct. Not their combatants, their infants, orphans so small, so numerous. She guided him to a compartment replete with aged correspondence and documents bound with ribbon. Amongst them was a photographic print identical to one of Landrum's. The identical barn, the identical stove, the identical female cradling the identical child. But this one bore an inscription penned in a precise script, "To the benevolent Americans who overlooked our adversarial status." Landrum listened as she recounted her recollections. Her memory, as is characteristic of all recollections of wartime, was fragmented, yet certain moments remained vivid. She recalled the chill of that spring, the aroma of kerosene and milk, the reverberation of engines outside the monastic gateway. "We presumed they intended to apprehend us," she declared. "Instead, they solicited our assistance." One individual, Miller, I believe, brought the sustenance. He appeared apprehensive to engage with the children. Then he offered a smile. I had not encountered a smile in years. She emitted a subdued chuckle, shaking her head. He presented me with his gloves ere their departure. He stated, "I shall have greater need of them." For a period, they remained in quietude, the clock's mechanism resonating between them. Landrum perceived a subtle alteration. A realization that history, despite its grandeur, was comprised of gestures so insignificant they nearly vanished. "Why did no one ever disseminate this narrative?" he inquired. Anneliese directed her gaze towards the window, where the urban traffic of Munich shimmered beneath the rain. "Because it was not a triumph," she responded. And few wished to recall kindness when there was so much ignominy. That evening, in his hotel chamber, Landrum arranged the photographs across his sleeping surface. He contemplated the multitude of narratives constructed upon conflagration and devastation, and how this singular, tranquil, domestically focused, and humane account had been relegated to obscurity. He transcribed until late into the night, meticulously assembling unit records, personal journals, and interviews. The subsequent morning, he dispatched a missive to the United States National Archives requesting authorization to publish the images in an academic periodical. The response arrived months later, approval granted, pending final verification. The photographs would finally be accessible for viewing. When the article was published the ensuing year under the designation Mercy Among Adversaries, the Nurses of Shui, 1945, it generated only a transient stir within academic circles, but a more profound impact among veterans and civilians who chanced upon it. Correspondence arrived from former medical personnel who recollected a barn situated somewhere in the vicinity of Nuremberg, and from German women who recounted their mothers' whispers of Americans who provided us with milk. None could precisely ascertain the locale or temporal context, but all conveyed a similar sense of astonishment, a manifestation of compassion where no logical basis for its existence could be found. Ultimately, Landrum's contribution evolved into more than a mere footnote. A modest museum exhibition followed, occupying a single, dimly illuminated room. The photographs were displayed in a contiguous sequence. Soldiers and nurses, firelight and infants, their visages unguarded. Visitors frequently paused the longest before one particular image, that of Anneliese tending to the infant, while Miller observed from behind her, his helmet set aside, his expression characterized as neither proud nor sorrowful, merely human. Beneath it, the caption read, "April, 1945, Compassion Endures." Anneliese attended the exhibition's inauguration from a wheelchair. She wore her venerable Red Cross emblem. When questioned about her most enduring recollection, she stated, "The sound of their respiration, the infants. Each exhalation was testament that we had not annihilated all." She paused, her eyes welling, and then added, "And the American who remained silent but stayed until the milk was warmed." Later that evening, as the illumination dimmed and patrons began to depart, Landrum discovered her seated in solitude before the photographic displays. She was humming a faint, broken melody under her breath. He recognized it from a notation in Miller's field journal, which he had encountered weeks prior. "A German lullaby. I do not know the words, but it remains with me." The historian departed, leaving her there, a silhouette amidst spectral figures, the room suffused with the faint silver radiance of captured benevolence. Outside, night enveloped Munich like a layer of ash interwoven with absolution. Years later, school children on museum tours would point to the photographs and inquire of their instructors. Were they companions? The teachers, perhaps possessing greater wisdom than historians, would offer gentle smiles and reply, "For a brief interval, they remembered how to be." History seldom accommodates moments of this nature. It enumerates victories, not tender affections, banners, not outstretched hands. But within those forgotten photographs, time itself seemed to halt, offering a reminder to anyone who looked with sufficient scrutiny that even in humanity's most somber hour, an individual still elected to embrace light. And somewhere, perhaps beneath the detritus of that ancient Bavarian barn, a solitary nail continued to rust in the beam where an American flag had once been affixed, marking the site where adversaries had nourished identical children and, for a fleeting moment in history, forgotten the import of enmity.